Okay, well, good afternoon, one and all. This is the penultimate day of SABR Virtual, and we have four speakers today. They are Dan Levitt, Rob Garratt, RJ Lesch, and Edward Scahill. And that means, of course, that Dan is first. Dan was elected to the SABR Board of Directors this past spring. He's an award-winning author of 4 baseball books, past president of the Halsey Hall chapter, and recipient of both the Henry Chadwick Award and the Bob Davids Award. His book, The Battle That Forged Modern Baseball, The Federal League Challenge and Its Legacy, won the Larry Ritter Award. He's a senior vice president for Ryan Companies, US, where he manages capital markets, studied at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and now makes his home in Minneapolis. So Dan, you are up.
All right, let's see if I can do the share screen here, which is always the challenge.
I see it. Now you'll have to go.
All right, that works?
Yep.
All right. So, maybe more than anyone else, John McGraw helped popularize baseball during the early decades of the last century. His larger-than-life personality, his instinctive dramatization of baseball contests, and his will to win at all costs brought new energy and fans to the national pastime. Longtime Giants executive Eddie Branick believed that John McGraw and Knute Rockne laid the foundation for the great sports expansion of modern years because they both knew so well how to dramatize and exploit sports and to carry their enthusiasm to the fans. Sid Mercer, one of New York's most respected sports writers, wrote, "I believe John McGraw was responsible more than any one man for the transition of big league ball into big business. His progressive ideas were major factors in promoting the sport out of old wooden stands and into the modern steel and concrete stadiums." Next to winning, nothing generates interest like controversy, and McGraw had an ability to create it in uniquely intimate way with the public. So what did McGraw do? Most notably, he was a great actor on the diamond. Giants pitching great Christy Mathewson commented upon McGraw's magic. McGraw gets the most out of a throng by his clever acting, without letting them know that he was doing it. Yet it is admitted that he can do more with a crowd, make it more malleable than any other man in baseball today. Christy Mathewson further described McGraw's third base antics. Did you ever watch the little manager crouching immovable at third base with a mitt in his hand when the New York club goes to bat in the 7th inning, 2 runs behind? The first hitter gets a base on balls. McGraw leaps into the air, kicks his heels together, claps his mitt, shouts at the umpire, runs in and pats the next batter on the back and says something to the pitcher. The crowd gets its cue, wakes up and leaps into the air, kicking its heels together. The whole atmosphere inside the park is changed in a minute, and the air is bristling with enthusiasm. The other coacher at first base is waving his hands and running up and down the line, while the men on the bench have apparently gained new hope. They are moving about restlessly, and the next 2 hitters are swinging their bats in anticipation with a vigor which augurs ill for the pitcher. The game has found Ponce de Leon's fountain of youth, and the little silent actor on the third base coaching line is the cause of the change. And as I've talked about at other times, McGraw was the most aggressive umpire baiter and battler of the era. His antics would fire up fans at the Polo Grounds and inflame the anti-Giant sentiment on the road. McGraw also created heightened awareness and excitement away from the Polo Grounds. When on the road, McGraw purposefully took his team to and from the ballpark in open carriages to incite the fans and inflame passions. The team was often targeted by eggs, bricks, rocks, produce, or whatever the opposing fans could conjure up. In Brooklyn, they hurled spears made from umbrella tips at the players. The Giants players often carried rocks to return fire. McGraw once described the experience in Pittsburgh. In those days, it was not unusual for the papers to announce that the rowdy Giants, accompanied by representatives of the Yellow Press, got in town this morning. We used to stay at the old Monongahela Hotel, and from there drove in open carriages to the ballpark, which was in Allegheny City across the river. To reach the bridge, we had to pass by the public marketplace. If we escaped the shower of small stones and trash outside the park, we were sure to get it as we passed the market. McGraw went on that they might also be, quote, greeted with a shower of old vegetables, potatoes, onions, tomatoes, and even cantaloupes. In Philadelphia, the abuse occasionally became so egregious that McGraw once asked for police protection. This simply incited the Philadelphians even more. They turned out the following days with additional rotten tomatoes and other fruits to launch at the Giants. McGraw quickly recognized the publicity value of his complaints and requests for police protection. He occasionally began asking for protection on trips to other cities, often to generate hype, as much as actually to try and find protection. McGraw had many other angles as well. Starting in spring training, McGraw would build enthusiasm for the forthcoming season. In 1906, for example, McGraw lodged the Giants in the swanky Peabody Hotel in Memphis, described as the city's social and business hub. Most other teams still stayed in boarding houses for spring training. Building up the image of baseball and its players was important to McGraw. He once talked about the issue. I am told that in the Army, the soldier who keeps himself the neatest and feels the classiest is usually the best fighter. Every regiment strives to get esprit de corps, as they call it. If a soldier is proud of his regiment and feels a pride in his appearance, he can be counted upon always. That is also true in baseball. For that reason, I have made a particular point of saying that my clubs always stop at the very best hotels that I can find. I see that they travel in first-class style on the railroads. I can remember well when first-class hotels would not take in that they would not take in ball clubs, under the impression that they were a rowdy lot. Often they were. We have overcome that. Today, most any hotel welcomes a ball team. Hall of Fame historian Lee Allen seconded McGraw's sentiment. McGraw lifted the game out of the theatrical boarding houses and into first-class hotels and became an international figure as recognizable in Tokyo as in Havana. Even in the spring, McGraw knew how to inspire the Giants fans and rile all the others. For example, that 1906 spring, he transported his team to and from their spring training grounds in wagons drawn by horses with the words "World Champions" stitched in blue on yellow saddle blankets in recognition of their 1905 World Series victory. That spring, McGraw also introduced new uniforms emblazoned with "World Champions" across the front, as you can see here on Mike Domlin. The new attire attracted almost as much attention for their lack of collars. One newspaper described the uniforms as, quote, rather fancy and collegiate, but it gives the champions a natty look, and that is what McGraw sought. McGraw also worked with sports writers, particularly during the spring. He provided stories that would get the fans back home excited. In many ways, he had a more instinctual understanding of how to exploit a story than they did. Dan Daniel, who covered New York baseball for more than 60 years, believed, McGraw was the only manager in my experience who knew a news story when he saw one. He was the greatest showman of all the pilots. Another well-known sports writer, Grantland Rice, pictured here, remembered McGraw's genius for helping young writers with a story. On his first road trip with the Giants in 1911, Rice was struggling over a story to file. I was trying to figure out a piece to write for the Mail, he said. I was in a Pullman seat pecking away when, to my surprise, McGraw moved in with me. What are you writing about today, he asked. I told him I hadn't yet stumbled on anything worth writing in the paper. I've got a story for you, he said. Together we worked out a good yarn. So I've talked a little bit about what he did, but is there actually any evidence that he did increase fan engagement and interest in baseball? And the answer is yes. The first item I'd like to look at is attendance. McGraw's first season as a manager was with the National League's Baltimore Orioles in 1899. As many of you know, after the 1898 season, several of the National League's owners who had interests in multiple teams consolidated their best players in one of the franchises. Baltimore and Brooklyn was one such case, and most of Baltimore's best players were moved to Brooklyn. So McGraw, who wanted to stay in Baltimore, effectively took over a mostly denuded franchise. Despite the stripping of the club, as you can see, attendance was pretty much the same in both 1898 and 1899. Moreover, in many ways, a better indicator of overall attendance is road attendance. And here the Orioles were 6th out of 12. After the season, the Orioles were contracted. McGraw next managed in the American League in Baltimore in their inaugural 1901 season. As a comparison, as you can see here, the team drew more fans than either of their last 2 years in the NL. And on the road, they were second in the league, though the teams were actually all pretty close in road attendance. In July 1902, McGraw jumped from Baltimore to the NL's New York Giants. This move and its aftermath was one of the seminal events of the war between the leagues. From the perspective of this presentation, the real evidence of McGraw's impact begins to show up with the Giants. In 1903, McGraw's first full year in New York, the team set the all-time attendance record to that date, though there were some accusations that their numbers were padded. In any case, the team showed a remarkable attendance boost. Road attendance is not available for 1903, but overall the increase in NL attendance was dramatic. And as I would suggest, based on some of the following slides, that much of this was driven by the interest generated by McGraw and the Giants. Here's the NL attendance for 1905. Once again, the Giants led the league in attendance. But what's really fascinating relative to McGraw's impact is the road attendance, which is available for a number of teams and a number of years in the Reach and Spalding guides from around 1899 to 1910 if people are interested in it. It's actually pretty fascinating information. Well, take a look at the bottom of the slide. The Giants on the road averaged a little over 7,200 fans per game. If we pull the Giants' home games and road games out of the NL totals, we can see that all the other games averaged just over 3,600 fans per game. In other words, when the Giants came to town, teams drew nearly twice the NL average as when other teams visited. This was obviously not all attributable to John McGraw, but he was surely a key factor in this increased fan enthusiasm. Here's another fun example of McGraw's popularity in 1905. This is after the final game of the World Series. As you can see, a huge crowd remained milling about the field, basically demanding that McGraw make a speech. If we jump ahead to 1908, we can see the Giants are still a huge draw, both home and away. At home, the team again set an all-time record with 910,000 patrons. But once more, there may have been a little padding to these numbers. Again, though, an overall comparison between the games with and without the Giants provides the best evidence for McGraw's and the Giants' appeal. As you can see towards the bottom of the slide, the Giants' road games averaged nearly 8,200 fans. Removing the Giants' home and road games from the rest of the league, NL teams averaged just over 5,200 fans. While not as extreme as in 1905, the Giants on the road still averaged roughly 60% more fans when compared to games between the other NL teams. Moreover, since McGraw joined the league in 1902, league attendance per game nearly doubled by 1908, from just under 3,000 in 1902 to more than 5,600 in 1908. This photo highlights the fever pitch to which New Yorkers now viewed the Giants. It's a picture of the Polo Grounds from the 1908 Merkle makeup game, effectively a playoff game. As you can see, there are spectators pretty much everywhere. Most amazingly, there are even fans parked on top of the grandstand. Estimates had around 80 to 100,000 fans traveling to the Polo Grounds hoping to get in. Despite a capacity of roughly 28,500 fans, most estimates had 40,000 cramming into the ballpark, many by jumping or climbing over 15-foot fences topped with barbed wire. Many others crowded into places around the area to catch glimpses of the game, such as the hollow below Coogan's Bluff, various areas on the elevator tracks, and on the 155th Street train station. The New York Times, without obvious irony, wrote, "There is no record of a sporting event that stirred New York as did the game of yesterday. No crowd so big ever was moved to a field of contest as was moved yesterday. Perhaps never in the history of a great city since the days of Rome and its arena contests has the people been pitched to such a key of excitement as was New York fandom yesterday." One more piece of evidence comes from the changing nature of baseball coverage in the New York Times. Outlined here in red is the story of the final game of the 1903 World Series, McGraw's first season in New York. As you can see, it isn't much, perhaps 2.5 paragraphs and a box score in the middle of the page. And the perspective of the last side even exaggerates the coverage. Here's a better look of where it falls in the paper, a tiny article in the middle of a page. Here's the Finals World Series game story from 1906 for the All-Chicago Series. Please note that I'm going to be looking at only non-New York World Series to remove any local influence from the level of coverage. The game coverage is now placed at the top of the page and in the left column, and it is much longer, running about 2/3 of the way down the page. Let's jump to 1910, when the Athletics defeated the Cubs. The New York Times now devotes 3 of their 7 columns to the final game and the end of the World Series. For a final look, let's jump to the last game of the 1915 World Series between the Phillies and the Red Sox. As you can see, the New York Times now allocates a full page to the ending of the World Series. I don't want to overstate the case. There were many reasons for the increase in interest in Major League Baseball in the first couple decades of the 20th century. But I think there can be little doubt that John McGraw was one of the most important. I'm going to end with one more quote, this one from Fred Lieb, one of baseball's best-known sports writers. "No man in the history of baseball has ever done more for the sport than the crafty, brilliant John McGraw. He has made baseball what it is in New York, and the entire National League is as much indebted to him as the New York club." Thank you. I'd be happy to address any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. As always, a wonderful presentation. If you have questions, please put them into the chat box on your screen. And we do have a few already, which if I can get this right. First one from Peter Cottrell. Can you give more details on the alleged padding of the attendance? Who was claiming that?
You know, it shows up in the Reach Guide that when they talk about the attendance for various teams, that possibly New York was padding it. I haven't done a whole lot of further investigation in it. Of course, the Reach Guide was the guide for the AL, and so it might have been a little biased against the Giants. But in both 1905 and 1908, the Reach Guide did mention that there were rumors of padding of the attendance figures.
Ah, okay. And as a follow-up to that from Mark Armour, do you think that McGraw acted deliberately to increase attendance? Like, for instance, Muhammad Ali hyping a fight. And he has a second question. Did some of the road fans go because they hated McGraw?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I think clearly that's what Mathewson was getting at a little bit there, where, you know, he talked about McGraw being a great actor and being able to get the fans involved without the fans realizing it. You know, I think McGraw, you know, it's a little bit more, you know, like Earl Weaver or Billy Martin. Some of it was just spontaneous, that he had a hot temper. But I don't think there's any question that a whole lot of it was quite calculated to bring out fans. And yes, I think that he purposely went to these games in open carriages. in order to get the fans excited to watch the Giants parade to the game across these bridges in Pittsburgh or down Broad Street in Philadelphia, and you know, get them to throw stuff at him and throw stuff back, and that was part of getting everybody excited.
Okay, good. Steve Treader wants to know, can you comment on McGraw's gambling and his acquisitions of players like Hal Chase and Heine Zimmerman? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, you know, that's a lot longer. that's a lot longer answer. The short answer, I would say, is that McGraw was always willing to take on sort of troubled ball players in the sense that he could reform them, whether it was, you know, folks who had problems with alcohol or folks who had problems with gambling. McGraw himself, of course, was an inveterate horse gambler. I would be surprised he was actually gambling on baseball, but there's certainly records of him, you know, having small bets on baseball games. But clearly he liked playing the horses, and I don't necessarily think he held it against someone for gambling. I would also say that McGraw, nothing was more important to him than winning a game, even in spring training. So I can't believe that he would have sort of countenanced Hal Chase throwing games on his team if he knew about it. But on the other hand, it's hard to believe he wouldn't have. So there's a lot there, and that's my relatively short answer to that long question, question with a lot of nuance to it.
Okay, well, let me combine a bunch of questions here. Justin Kayal, sorry about the pronunciation, asked, where did McGraw get his instinct for promotion? John Gregory wants to know if there's anyone in today's game who reminds you of McGraw. And John B. wants to know about McGraw and promotions and advertising.
I'll take the last one first. He did have a cigar named after him in 1902. He didn't do a whole lot of stuff with advertising. Of course, he spent, I think, 13 weeks in vaudeville. It's either 1911 or 1912. So he certainly got his name out there, but he did not do a lot of advertising. Again, a lot of players weren't a whole lot involved, but McGraw was surprisingly not as involved as one might have thought. What was the first two parts of that again, Neal?
Where did McGraw get his instinct for promotion? And is there anybody in today's game who reminds you of him? Yeah.
Well, thank you. I don't know. You know, he basically got to the majors at like as a 20 and 21-year-old, and you know he was managing by the time he was 26, so he was very precocious. But I think it was just fairly instinctual, and it came to him when he was with the Orioles, the old Baltimore Orioles of the National League, when they were involved. So, you know, and today, I don't know that there's anyone really today. I would think that sort of Earl Weaver and Billy Martin would have been two that I would compare to that. But on the other hand, I don't know that they were sort of holistically looking to try and build attendance. I also think, of course, it was earlier at the time. People's only real experience with baseball was through the newspaper or at the ballpark. So as a manager, you had an incredible ability to influence the fans because you were the guy at the ballpark and you were the one talking to sports writers. Today, we have so many other options where, you know, you have players having direct relationship with the fans through social media. We have 24/7, you know, sports channels. We have the television with the announcers. So I just think that it was a time where if you were focused, there were really only two ways to interact with the fans, and McGraw was really good at both.
Okay. How much of an influence did McGraw have with player acquisitions? This is from Stephen. And stadium design. And how did he feel about sharing the Polo Grounds with the Yankees?
Well, I think on player acquisitions, I mean, McGraw was the GM. I mean, there was a couple of times, once in 1911, where there was a trade made without his, 1914, where there was a trade made without his permission, and he was extremely upset about it because he was away on the around the world tour. And so, I mean, McGraw basically had full control of player transactions. He was effectively the GM. The owners were not making trades. At the time, just as an aside, you know, the GM really didn't come into play until around 1920 and later. And before that, either the owner or the general manager was the person making all of those decisions. So that would be, you know, my take on him on the players. I don't think he had much effect on the design of the Polo Grounds when they redid it after the fire. And as to sharing with the Yankees, I think he was happy. he didn't care about cheering with the Yankees. I mean, no one cared about the Yankees until Babe Ruth came along. And then, as we know, McGraw and owner Charles Stoneham decided to kick the Yankees out, which was, you know, possibly a mistake, because then they ended up with the Palace of Yankee Stadium. But I think as long as the Yankees were clearly second-class citizens, he was more than happy to share the stadium with them.
Okay, I've got one more. Scroll down to it. This is from Brad Kuprick. Any evidence of other teams, managers, or players getting fed up with McGraw's antics, or did everyone realize it was just for show?
Well, I think pretty much everybody was fed up with it. I think that at a certain extent, the National League protected John McGraw because, at least during the 1900s, John Grush, who was the owner of the Giants, was probably the most powerful owner in the National League. And between he and John McGraw, the National League was pretty much unwilling to take any actions against them. I mean, they had a lot of really egregious actions with the umpires. I mean, there was a game where they, you know, locked the umpires out of the game because they were mad at a call the previous day. And, you know, McGraw just ended up with a relatively small fine and a short suspension. I think all the other owners, you know, Pulliam, the president of the National League, hated John McGraw. They hated each other. Barney Dreyfuss, the owner of the Pirates, hated John McGraw. I think maybe at some level they understood that he was good for the game, but I think at a personal level, a lot of them really disliked McGraw and would have been happy if they had been able to get him out of the league.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. As always, an excellent presentation. We're going to move on now to our second presentation on Muggsy McGraw Day. Let me mute Dan and unmute Rob Garratt. I think, oops, did that not work? Okay.
I think I'm unmuted.
Okay. Let me introduce Rob. His paper is called Rogers Hornsby of the New York Giants, McGraw and Stoneham's 1927 Gambit to win the city's fan base. And Rob is an emeritus professor of English and Humanities at nearby University of Puget Sound, where he taught in the honors program for 22 years. He's written widely on modern Irish literature, and hence McGraw. He grew up in the Bay Area as a fan of the Giants. His latest book is Home Team, The Turbulent History of the San Francisco Giants, which won the Seymour Medal was a finalist for the Seymour Medal in 2018. And he's working now on a biography of Charles Stoneham, who owned the team, of course, until 1935. I believe that Jacob was going to bring up your presentation, so
That's right.
It is there.
Okay, thanks very much. Jacob, I'm going to rely on you to kind of click because I wasn't able to bring mine up. So, hello everybody. This is a brave new experience for me. I appreciate the introduction, Neal. Look forward to talking with everyone. I'm interested mainly in looking at Rogers Hornsby. He became a Giant for 1 year. How it happened, why he came, and what were John McGraw and Charles Stoneham hoping to do with Hornsby in New York. And I want to place the story, as I do with Charles Stoneham's biography, very much in the context of time, place, and culture. And as a way of framing it and probably making it more understandable. So I'm going to be looking at New York City and the Jazz Age in this particular presentation. So if you could give me slide number 1, please. Certainly, Roger Hornsby coming to New York City in the late 1920s was a Jazz Age event, but it was also the realization of a Jazz Age dream by 2 Jazz Age owners, John McGraw and Charles Stoneham. And they were looking to find a way to counter Babe Ruth and the surging New York Yankees, who had become the toast of the town. Now, Dan made a point in his presentation of how acute and aware McGraw was about attendance. And I think this is something that really annoyed both Stoneham and McGraw, was that the Yankees were starting to take over and become the real club of New York City. And this is something I want to come back to as we get into this more. They were also, I think, trying to figure out a way to bring their own hero to the fore. The 1920s, they were a decade of heroes, celebrities, stars, personalities, and the Giants wanted one of their own to counter particularly Babe Ruth, who became a bigger-than-life character in New York City. But they also were interested in getting fans back into the Polo Grounds and enjoying that surge that Dan Levitt in his paper talked about, how the Giants were dominating the National League. Many Americans in the 1920s were dreamers. Could I have the next slide, please? Yearning for prosperity, the good life, improvement, enjoyment in fast-paced world of glamour, of action, entertainment, business. And maybe the first and foremost of all the Jazz Age dreamers, next slide, please, came off the pages of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Chronicle of the Jazz Age, and that would be Jay Gatsby himself, who dreamt of a future with a woman from his past whom he transforms through his romantic imagination into an idealized lover. So strong is Jay Gatsby's desire for this happiness in this life that he overlooks who she really is and sees her only as he wants to see her. Now, Fitzgerald's novel does a lot more than simply develop a tremendous character in American literature. It also shows us the age, its parties, its fast cars, its music, its drinking. But it also contrasts the notions of the tensions between dreams and reality. And that's something that I'd like to make a point about later on in the paper. McGraw and Stoneham were also Jazz Age dreamers. And their obsession to counter Ruth and compete with the Yankees caused them to see in Rogers Hornsby more than he really was, and to imagine that he could do more than he would. He became for them a Gatsby-like illusion, as we shall see. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, there was no illusion about Roger Hornsby, the player, and Jacob, if you can just start clicking on these various things, that would be a help to me. There was no illusion about Rogers Hornsby, the player, nor about his achievements over the years. He was dominant in all categories in hitting. He reached his peak as a Cardinal in the early 1920s, led his team to the World Series in 1926 and was the World Series champion that year. He averaged over 200 hits in 8 of his seasons, and he was over 400, batting over 400 in 3 of those years. So indeed, he was a major star in the National League. The next slide, please. I'm sorry for this confusion here, and I apologize. I just couldn't bring my own PowerPoint up. Even before Hornsby put up these numbers, McGraw and Stoneham, particularly McGraw, who was managing the Giants all through the decade of the teens when Hornsby broke in, McGraw saw something in Hornsby that he liked, even in the early years, probably potential for future greatness. And he began dreaming and scheming about how to make him a Giant. Next click, please. The first attempt was with Charles Stoneham's advice and also his pocketbook. Deep pockets, he assured McGraw that he would be willing to spend. And he made his first attempt after Stoneham, in Stoneham's first season, 1919, toward the end of the season. It was an improbable moment, really. They decided to meet Branch Rickey, the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals, and negotiate with him. They decided that they ought to do this in a Manhattan tavern after an afternoon game. Now, McGraw and Stoneham were both drinking men, but of course they misread their audience completely. Branch Rickey was a famous teetotaler, and perhaps they thought the atmosphere of a tavern might give them the advantage of making Branch Rickey an offer he couldn't refuse. But refuse he did. And the reason for that was he demanded that McGraw include Frank Frisch in the trade, and McGraw at that time in his career and in Frisch's career did not want to part with him. He was a budding young star that McGraw and Stoneham both liked. Next click, please. They tried again to get Hornsby as a Giant in the mid-1920s. Again with Branch Rickey, similar results. Frisch was the stumbling block again. And next click, please. And their third attempt was in 1923, another failed attempt. McGraw was thoroughly frustrated by now with dickering with Rickey and horse trading and all that. And again, the same stumbling block was Frisch. And his quote to the New York Times after this third attempt, "So far as I'm concerned, the proposed deal for Hornsby is off for all time. I wouldn't trade Frisch for Hornsby or any other player in baseball." And that was in the New York Times, November 17th, 1923. Now, Dan, I think, has mentioned in other papers, and maybe even in this last one, that we ought to take everything that McGraw says with a grain of salt. He was a great promoter. This idea that he would never, the deal is off for all time, certainly didn't hold much water because, next slide, please. They go after him again in December 1926, the winter meetings, and this time they're successful. They do land Rogers Hornsby, but the reason for that is that McGraw and Frisch had a terrible falling out in the late part of the 1926 season, and McGraw was quite happy to get rid of Rogers Hornsby, as was Branch Rickey and Sam Braden, the St. Louis Cardinal owner. They were happy to get rid of Hornsby, so it was a match, you might say, made in heaven. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, things change, as Dan pointed out, and I think some of the questions about that were out for Dan about what happens to the Yankees. Well, 1920, of course, Ruth alters the fan base in New York City. Much to the chagrin and the annoyance of McGraw and Stoneham, by the way, the Yankees were tenants at the Polo Grounds, and they were outdrawing their own. They were outdrawing their host, and this really got under the skin of both McGraw and Stoneham. Moreover, Ruth was quickly becoming a celebrity and a man about town. His bigger-than-life personality was news both on and off the field. Could I have the next slide, please? When the Giants and the Yankees met in 1921 for the World Series, all they wanted to do with McGraw was to talk about Ruth. They didn't care much talking about the Giants. What was he going to do about youth and so on? And this, of course, because McGraw was so used to being in the limelight and so on, really annoyed him. There's something interesting in this quote that you can see. Not only is his consternation about how Ruth is being propped up, but if you see in the second line, he obviously still had this great admiration and this idea that Rogers Hornsby was, in fact, a terrific player. And of course, this is done with tongue in cheek, but nonetheless, Hornsby was, for McGraw, a great, great, great player. Next slide, please. Now, there is no confusing what happened. First, I'll take the first click. In 1920, of course, Ruth arrives. If you'll notice in 1919, the Giants led all of baseball in attendance, and they certainly outdrew the Yankees that year. But 1919, 1920, 1921, and 1922, as I've said, the Yankees were tenants, and you can see the effect of their attendance once Ruth is aboard. Only, next slide, please. Only in 1925, and this is the year that Ruth was ill, and he played half the time, I think, did the Giants barely outdraw the Yankees. And this would be the only time in the decade, by the way, that the Giants were New York's #1 drawing team. On the next slide, please. Rogers Hornsby arrives in 1927, and nonetheless, this happens to be, of course, the Yankees' great year, the 1927 team, Ruth's amazing home run record, and so on. This is, of course, bad luck on the part of the Giants, but nonetheless, you could see the attendance being very, very clear there. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, 1926, the Giants suffered a bad year. They had a lot of internal problems. Players went down. Frankie Frisch was a difficulty for McGraw. It was a bad year in general for the Giants. But interestingly, it put put the dream that McGraw announced in 1923, we'll never again try to deal for Hornsby. That was on the back burner. Surely that came forward now, and McGraw and Stoneham both had a chance to watch this confrontation between these two superstars, if you will, coming to Yankee Stadium for part of the World Series and watching them in action. So I think this in a way pushed the dream, the idea of acquisition, looking maybe the interest in, it was rekindled certainly in both the minds of both Stoneham and McGraw, and partly because they knew their situation was difficult in New York as the team that they wanted to get back into the fan base and want the fans to come back into the stands. And this was a chance for them to really look at the two. Maybe Hornsby would in fact be that counter to the great Ruth. Next slide, please. The last out in the 1926 World Series was the famous Ruth trying to attempted steal at second base, and there's Roger Hornsby putting the tag on. I like to think this is a sort of symbolic moment. Certainly, I imagine, and I have no evidence for this, I imagine that both Stoneham and McGraw saw in this a symbolic moment. Here is Hornsby tagging Ruth out. I think they saw this metaphorically because it certainly was something that they'd been wanting to do. How do they find their own answer to Ruth? And Hornsby was this kind of star. May I have the next slide, please? So in winter meetings in 1926, both Stoneham and McGraw decided full negotiations to go on with Sam Breeden and Branch Rickey, and they landed McGraw. Frisch was, of course, expendable, as I've indicated, and this seemed to be the reason that both sides could actually make the deal. I chose these two quotes, these two articles, because they show the national interest in this topic. The one on the left is from the Los Angeles Times, and the one on the right is from the New York Times. Now, in doing this, I wanted to point out one other writer, a quote from John Sheridan, who was a writer for the Sporting News, July issue. He lays out some of the things about Hornsby that are problematic that people knew about him, not as a player now, this is as a man. He impressed many people as being distant and preoccupied, if not downright unfriendly. One player remarked that Raj kept distinctly aloof from his teammates. He insisted on rooming by himself, hard to approach, difficult to understand. He seemed to have nothing but contempt for the usual likes and dislikes of the average player. Now, certainly McGraw and Stoneham were savvy to all kinds of things about players and probably knew and understood this aspect, but for some reasons, more important to them was the possibility that Hornsby could be that counter to Ruth. They preferred to overlook this. Next slide, please. Things were rosy at the start of the season, although the Giants came out of the blocks slowly. Nonetheless, the management, the upper management, the front office, McGraw himself, were quite happy with Hornsby and having him on board. Next slide, please. Now you can start clicking through these particular things while I talk about them. Certainly, Hornsby had proved to be the player on the field that they hoped for. I wanted to look particularly at that record as player manager, 45-12. McGraw took ill in the middle of the season, 1927, and Hornsby took over as the player manager. And this is where things started to get tense. A number of the players objected to his style. He told them that they needed to just curb their enthusiasm and stop. He's the boss. He also managed to affront the ownership. Jim Tierney, the general secretary, met him in the lobby of a hotel. Confront is too strong a word, I think, asking him about a choice for a pinch hitter, and Hornsby exploded on him, told him he didn't know anything about baseball. Why didn't he stick to things he knew about, like getting cabs for players and arranging for trains and hotel rooms, and leave everything about baseball to me. Charles Stoneham had also an encounter with him once and asked him about a particular move on the field, and he told Stoneham he might as well forget about it, and if he didn't like what he was doing, why didn't he get somebody else to manage for him? So his abrupt contempt, his arrogance, this is something Sam Breeden once mentioned, to having a conversation with Rogers Hornsby was like having gravel poured down the back of your shirt. Can I have the next slide, please? At the end of the season, after 1 year of this attempt to kind of bring in a superstar of their own to measure the Yankees, Rogers Hornsby is gone. Traded for the good of the Giants, as they say. Now, this was such a shock to everyone. It was a shock certainly to the reporters. A number of them said, you might as well put us in a room and have the roof fall on us that this news came about. So how did this happen so quickly after 1 year, and all the preparation, all the dreaming, all the attempts to get Rogers Hornsby? Why did it turn this way? Well, it was that they couldn't quite reconcile the player versus the man. And it was obviously the brass, particularly Stoneham, could not abide the off-field problems, nor could McGraw really. It was Hornsby the man rather than Hornsby the player who did himself in. His personality, his contemptuousness, his public criticism of ownership, his outspoken contempt, and add to this, next slide, please. He was a well-known player of horses, and he had a reputation for reneging on his bets. And this would really push Stoneham as an example. Charles Alexander, Rogers Hornsby's biographer, thinks this may have been, in fact, the final push for Stoneham, that he had a kind of notion of honor among gambling. You met your debts. You stood your ground on this. You were honorable. And Hornsby always seemed to be getting into difficulty. And finally, in this case, you can see the examples here. He goes to court. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, the writers all over the country were speculating on this, and eventually it came out that that it was Stoneham himself who was the final arbiter. McGraw went along with this, but McGraw left town and let Stoneham and Tierney make the announcement, and surely he was gone to the Boston Braves for a couple of rather journeyman kind of players. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. So what about Rogers Hornsby then? This is what Charles Alexander in his biography of Hornsby calls the, he began a peregrination, really, what Alexander terms it, touring the National League. Of course, he had difficulties in St. Louis and in New York, and then the Braves really let him go more for financial reasons, although the owner there was also kind of taken by him. He wore out his welcome in Chicago with the Cubs after a couple of years, and he finally goes back to Chicago, to the Cardinals for a brief moment, and then ends up his career in the American League with the St. Louis Browns. Okay, next. What about our Jazz age owners? What about them? How did they react to the idea of their failure at coming to terms with this? Next slide, please. A look at the final part of Great Gatsby might help us. He realizes that his own failure had come because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. His dream had gone beyond her, beyond Daisy, the woman he completely reinvents, and beyond everything. Okay, next slide, please. In the end, it was the colossal vitality of their illusion on how to best Ruth and the Yankees. Both Stoneham and McGraw overreached, imagining Roger Hornsby to be something that he was not. Hornsby was gone, reality had settled in, and the Giants would have to adjust as New York's second team. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Interesting as always. If I might have a point of personal privilege to ask a question or to make a statement, toward the end there, I was reminded of the adventures of Dick Allen going from team to team to team. Of course, there's a difference there because his teammates really liked him. Management, not so much, but other than Frank Thomas, Allen's teammates were pretty friendly to him. So let's see what we've got for other questions. We have Steve Treader, of course, saying that his understanding is that Stoneham made the trade to the Braves without McGraw's knowledge or consent. Is that not true?
Well, that's one version of it. I think that Stoneham certainly took the lead. McGraw knew about it. McGraw, there are a couple of one reporter suggests that McGraw went to Stoneham in late part of the season and said it's either him or me, meaning that there was a sense that maybe McGraw was going to step down and Hornsby would become the manager. Stoneham didn't want that to happen. But I think Steve's got a point here that McGraw wouldn't have made that decision on his own. I think that Stoneham pushed him, and in fact, Stoneham was quite adamant that Hornsby's days as a Giant were over once he had had that personal few confrontations with Hornsby himself.
Okay, excellent. Bob Trostler asks, oops, I lost it there. Didn't Hornsby own some shares of Cardinals stock before he was swapped to New York?
Yes, he did. And that was one of the difficulties with the trade, is it became a National League issue. All the owners eventually had to come up and, in order to make the trade work, and McGraw and Stoneham were insistent that Hornsby would start at second base for the New York Giants when the season opened, that they had to scramble and pay off. The Cardinals had to buy him out because he couldn't hold stock with the Cardinals and be a player with New York. And so they ended up patching this together so that Hornsby would be paid off by all of the other 6 owners, and Stoneham decided to kick in a little extra for legal fees.
Wow. Again, you can ask questions by writing into the chat box. David Lippman wants to know, did the players complain to Stoneham or McGraw directly, or did they, quote, learn a lot by observing, unquote?
Well, we have a couple of sources, New York papers, that a number of players came forward to the front office. If they went directly to Stoneham, I'm not aware of that. However, I know that they're on record, at least by these reporters' allegations, that they were quite fed up with Hornsby. And they, one of the things he demanded is that nobody play cards, and everybody get to bed on time. He was a no-nonsense sort of guy. And of course, he was not a drinker himself. So he curtailed all the nightlife, and the players were feeling the pinch. Although they did perform for him very well, he pushed the Giants back into the race. They ended up 2 games out at the end of the season. So his stern measures didn't restrict them on the field, but they certainly didn't like him.
We have another question from Melissa and Charles. What do you think of the fact that Hornsby's team's records did not worsen in the year after he was traded? If the Cardinals switch out Hornsby for Frisch, that's understandable. But how to account for the Giants faring as well in 1928 as in 1927? Well,
I'm not sure I can follow Hornsby's career after 1927 very well, just very generally. The Braves, of course, did not have a great year in 28, and the Cubs were, I think, he played well with them and enjoyed that, but he again ran afoul of the front office. What happened in 1927, though, I think, was that he just simply burnt his bridges, and the Giants, they came close, but they didn't perform initially. Their slow start kind of doomed them.
Glenn Guzzo wants to reverse the position here. How did Hornsby react to being unwanted by team after team?
Again, I'd like to just keep it to the 1927, although he did say when he was signed in Chicago that he's really going to look forward to this. He said, I can't tell you the past. I don't want to go to the past. I'm not a Giant anymore. I'm a Brave, or so on and so forth. What he did do, though, was take some shots at both the Cardinals and the Giants and said he didn't like their ownership. He thought the ownership was terrible. It'll never go anywhere, and so on. He was quite critical of the past.
The last question will be from Mark Armour. Do you think the late 1920s version of Stoneham and McGraw were less strong, both in health and finances, and less likely to be able to deal with someone as strong as Hornsby? Do you think the 1915 version of McGraw could have handled him better?
That's a difficult question for me, although I think it's a very interesting question. Some people feel that the trade to Boston pushed Stoneham into the leadership in player personnel, and McGraw became a second fiddle at that time. I'm not really sure I can agree with that. I think there's some evidence for it. McGraw's health was failing, and certainly Stoneham started to become more assertive in player decisions. But I think McGraw was a different person in 1915, so it may very well be that if he had Hornsby then, he might have had no difficulties with him.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Rob. Of course, you can ask him further questions by getting in touch with Rob directly from the SABR directory or other places. Let me mute him, and I will unmute RJ. And in the meantime, RJ, I don't have you with a camera.
Oh, yes, I will turn that on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, so I will start my video and
Okay.
share my screen.
Let me introduce you now. Your paper is titled Bugs Raymond, Fact and Fiction, How Stories About the Ball Player Reflect Popular Attitudes About Alcoholism and Substance Abuse During the 20th Century. RJ is a business analyst living in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's been a White Sox fan since the Harry Carey days and a SABR member since 1998. He's a member of the Dead Ball era and Baseball and the Arts Committees, and was a co-founder of the Field of Dreams chapter back in Iowa and the Central Pennsylvania chapter. He's also an avid fencer, so watch out. He's a certified fencing coach, and his specialty is, of course, the saber. RJ Lesch, it's yours.
Thank you. I'll be talking about Bugs Raymond, whose pitching career was cut short by alcoholism. And more important than the specifics of Raymond's career, which anyone can look up in any encyclopedia, are the stories told about the ball player and how those stories over the course of the decades after his death changed, or as I found, did not really change, as the United States' attitudes towards alcoholism and substance abuse changed during the 20th century. As I mentioned, for over a half century after his death, he was a favorite of sports writers looking for stories about baseball's colorful characters. Grantland Rice knew Raymond when both men were in Atlanta in 1904, and Rice, reflecting years later, said, "Good copy is always scarce. Raymond sounded like good copy." And that was the case for many sports writers throughout the years. I'm going to break down one particular story. If you've ever heard a Bugs Raymond story, it's probably a variation of this one. This one, the one I'm using here is appeared in True magazine, although many of the facts given are not supported by evidence. But John Lardner tells this story in True magazine in December of 1960. This purports to be the story of Raymond's last appearance in a major league uniform. Leading up to this point, Raymond was a very good player. He was the best player, arguably, on a Cardinals team that won only 47 games. His record was solid under the circumstances, and as such, he was one of 3 players traded to the Giants for Roger Bresnahan during that offseason. 1909, he turned in another fairly solid season. However, he was fined repeatedly for missing games or showing up late to games or showing up late to games in no condition to pitch. And it was eventually suspended with about a month to go in the season. He made his last appearance with a month to go in the season, and then was suspended subsequently. You can see there the amount of fines that McGraw imposed upon upon Raymond, although the story goes that many of those fines found their way back to Raymond's wife, who had 2 young children to take care of and enough problems of her own. But, and at least that's the story that was told years later. 1910, Raymond is completely ineffective, and even though McGraw at this point has hired a detective to keep tabs on Raymond and to follow him around to keep him out of trouble, it doesn't work. The detective quits in disgust, and Raymond is suspended in July. Now, there was an attempt as a result of this to try to help him recover, and during the course of the off-season, Raymond went to the Keeley Institute, which was a pioneering facility for alcohol and alcohol recovery. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So he starts off fairly well in spring training. He has a couple of lapses here and there, but for the most part is going along pretty well until things start to go rocky in June of that year. So that's the background for Lardner's story. Now, according to the story, the Giants are hosting the Pirates at the Polo Grounds, which isn't the case. The Polo Grounds have been burned down and they're being rebuilt, so they're playing at Hilltop, and I won't get into all that just yet. Anyway, according to the story, Rube Marquard does not have his best stuff, so McGraw throws him a new ball and says, "Go out and warm up. It looks like I'm going to need you." 2 innings later, Marquard gets into trouble, and Hannes Wagner is coming to the bat, and McGraw waves in Raymond. We see there the cartoon with the staggering walk. We see Raymond maintaining a dignified silence except for a slight belch, etc. His first pitch sails over the catcher's head. A runner scores. The second pitch, Wagner taps the ball back to Raymond. Bugs picks it up, throws it over the catcher's head. Another run scored, and that's the end of Raymond. The story that is told is that Bugs took the brand new ball that he had been given with which to warm up, walked past the bullpen out of the Polo Grounds, and traded the baseball for 4 shots of rye whiskey. As I said, if you've probably heard any story about Raymond, you've heard this story. The next day, at McGraw's suggestion, he left the game forever, except, as we'll see, it's a little more complicated than that. This is a very durable story. The version of this story is told over many years. McGraw tells an abbreviated version of it in which Raymond doesn't come back to the park. The Giants trainer goes out looking for Raymond and finds him in the bar where he sold the ball. Frank Graham tells essentially the same story in the New York Giants 1952 version, and I think in a couple of earlier editions of the book, but it's told from McGraw's first-person perspective. I did this, I did that. But basically the same facts that Lardner is using in his story. Red Smith's syndicated column in 1967 picks it up. Now, one of the things I'm interested in is baseball as a social history, and how we use stories about ball players to illuminate other aspects of American life, particularly. And one of the things I wondered about as I was stumbling across all these Bugs Raymond stories and stories about other players' struggles with alcohol and other things like depression, anxiety disorders, things like that, is how do these stories change as time goes by and as people's perception of alcoholism in this case changed during the course of the 20th century. The United States, for example, has had an interesting relationship with alcoholism. There was the growth of the temperance movement in the late 19th century. There was the development of alcoholism as a disease concept, and the conflict between these two goes on for about half a century there. There are the people who are believing alcoholism is a disease, it can be cured or at least treated, and people can live happy, healthy lives. There's the belief that no, it's a moral failing, it's just these people are lazy or are reprehensible in some way. This battle between the two viewpoints is a conflict that we see in popular culture, and we'll get into some of that in a moment. For some of the timeline, which is going to be familiar to most of you, the United States of America passes the 18th Amendment of the Constitution prohibiting the sale of and transport of alcoholic beverages, and then repeals it 13 years later. In the aftermath of that, the question then is, okay, well, prohibition didn't work. What do we do about people who are having difficulty with alcohol? Alcoholics Anonymous rises in the aftermath of that, and we start seeing more sophisticated versions of counseling and support for alcohol recovery in the development of the Minnesota model, and that's about where I stop here because I'm of the model I'm going to look at next. One of the things I wondered about as I'm comparing sports writers' tales about alcoholism and so forth is looking for a model that attempts to put this into a social context. And I'm looking at one from a sociologist named Robin Room, who he and several other people have developed a model for looking at alcohol in use in American film. They track, Room and his colleagues track 3 phases in American film history. So the first 2 decades of the 20th century, we're looking at the approach to prohibition, in which filmmakers employ 2 key archetypes of drunkenness, which we'll go into in a moment: the comic drunk and the drunkard's progress. Following which is the reaction to prohibition, the wettening of America, where people start to say, well, maybe it's not so bad, and in fact, maybe it's kind of funny and cute, haha. Following which, after, as we talked about with the development of the Minnesota model and other developments in treatment of alcoholism, is a more mature synthesis of these archetypes into a more sophisticated way of looking at alcoholism. The comic drunk. We're all familiar with the conventions of the comic drunk, and Room and his colleagues break down some of the characteristics of this. We've seen these in popular culture for probably as long as we've been aware of popular culture. Room and his colleagues talk about, they're not real drunks. They're not scary. They're not the sort of people you would leave the room if they walked in. A real drunk, you wouldn't laugh at their antics, but the comic drunk in a movie or a television show, yeah, sure, that's funny. There's something about it that's not real and makes it okay to laugh at. Power to perform feats that would be impossible while sober. The wobbly walk, we saw that in the Lardner tale. Problems in focusing on a person or object, we saw that in the Lardner tale. The elaborately explained but nonsensical logic, I'll give an example of that, and immunity to conventions of decorum in a moment. But the idea being that the comic drunk is able to perform the impossible. Here's another Grantland, like I said, Grantland Rice probably told a Bugs Raymond story every year or so during the 40s and 50s. If somebody came along like Jimmy Pearsall, who was sort of a colorful character in the parlance, Bugs Raymond would come up. And this is you know, again, I find it hard to believe that the audience in the 50s knew who Bugs Raymond was, except they knew because Rice kept bringing it up. Anyway, Rice tells the story about how Raymond once ate a whole turkey, drank 2 bottles of scotch, and won a doubleheader because you can perform the impossible. Fractured logic. Another famous Raymond story is where McGraw's reading back the report from the detective who he had sent to trail Raymond. And the story there, you can read it. You had 2 beers and you ate 3 onions. Then you went to the next place and ate 3 more onions. In the third place, 2 rye, 2 onions. And Bugs is incensed because he didn't have but 2 onions all night. Not the point of the story, but that's the fractured logic in the comic drunk, and that's employed in the storytelling. So what I thought when I was looking at the film model is that would apply equally well to modeling how sports writers are telling stories, and I'm going to show you how that turned out not to be the case. The other key archetype that we see in discussions of alcoholism is the drunkard's progress, and this is a grimmer look at the problem. This Currier and Ives print was famous in the late 19th century. It shows a guy going from conventional social drinking to hanging out with unsavory companions to dissolution, despair, eventually suicide, and death and abandonment of everything he loves. So describing the stories that we're telling in using this archetype are either describing the moral and physical ills of drunkenness, but salvation's possible through suffering or repentance. An interesting short film by D.W. Griffith called What Drink Did, which came out in 1909. The still here is featuring the death of this man's daughter, who has gone to rescue him from the saloon, and in the course of an altercation that breaks out at the saloon, the daughter is struck by a bullet and killed. And the despair at losing his child leads the man to repent from alcohol and return to what is left of his family. Alcohol in American film, we talked about the reaction to prohibition and the wetting of America. So in the 20s and 30s, the stories about when we see alcohol in film and other stories, it's normalized, even glamorized. I had to get Myrna Loy into a SABR presentation at some point, so here she is. But this became a staple of this period, the reaction to prohibition and the once again, glamorization of alcoholism. Following World War II and the realization, I think, that substance abuse and alcoholism was a social problem that couldn't just be glamorized away, we start to see, and Room and his colleagues talk about this, the classic period. So now films that people are familiar with, of course, The Lost Weekend, we're still looking at some of the elements of the 2 archetypes, the comic drunk and the drunkard's progress, but they're being reformulated consistent with new understandings of what alcoholism is and how the toll it takes on people. So whereas before, Charlie Chaplin might take a drink and wander through dangerous situations and not necessarily be affected by them, whereas the sober people following along in his wake trying to save him are injured or whatever. Instead of looking at that as a comic situation, we're now looking at that in this light. Now, Chaplin is not choosing to do these superhuman feats. They're basically compelled actions that are out of his control. And the people who are following along in his wake are immune to his charms. I like this quote. I can't remember the movie it's from at the moment, but I got you out of jams because I was paid, not because I liked you. We're familiar with Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, of course, who won the Oscar for that performance. We're familiar with Ronald Reagan playing Pete Alexander in The Winning Team, using that same sort of approach. Surprisingly, what I would have expected to see is that the stories that are told about Raymond and Raymond's alcoholism, as durable as a subject as Raymond was, I would have expected to see some modification of those stories over time, that they would have followed this path from the 1920s and 1930s, wetting of America, to the more sophisticated approach of the classic period, and I did not see that. They basically remain stuck in the comic drunk archetype. And this is also true of other, I didn't include in this study, but this is also true of portrayals of other alcoholics and addicts in sports. The, you know, Rube Waddell, Phil Douglas, and other people, when their stories are being told in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they're stuck in this comic drunk archetype, primarily because they're being told by the same storytellers, Grantland Rice trucking it out every year, for example. And later storytellers are following the same conventions as the older storytellers. I gave the Glory of Their Times example here. This is 1966. That's classic comic drunk example right there. I mentioned that Raymond was an attendant at the Keeley Institute. This was a pioneering and wanting to talk a little bit now about Raymond's path and following his baseball career. Drunkenness is a disease. This was an attempt to treat drunkenness as a disease. The Keeley Institute had you know, there were not bars on the windows. People were free to come and go. The rule was that they stayed there for 31 days. They showed up for their double chloride of gold injections. What was in this solution is open to dispute, and nobody really knows, although there have been several attempts to do some forensic medicine to determine what was in them. But basically the idea was that they were there to be treated as human beings, to learn how to overcome their alcohol addictions or opiate addictions as well, through a program of daily rest, healthy diet, adequate sleep. The Keeley Institutes were going full roar in 1910, and when Raymond went to it, it was news. So people were, so this is John Foster, but this is an example, but people were, now you'll see here, I won't read this, but this is some of the coded knowledge, coded language that people were using to refer to alcoholism in the popular press. A man of Raymond's peculiar temperament in a line of conduct which leads to his downfall. In other words, his drinking. Couldn't come out and say that, but people reading this knew what was going on. And for the most part, one of the things that's interesting, I think, about Raymond is that people keep wanting him to succeed. People want to keep giving him second and third and fourth chances. We don't really know much about him other than that. We don't, and the stories that are told about him, and it's kind of a shame because it seems as if the comic drunk stories kind of overshadow what kind of person he might have been, or maybe they don't. Maybe that's all there is to it. We have no way of knowing. I'll just be very brief about this part. One of the things I wondered is whether we could trace some of Raymond's rapid decline in 1909 and 1910 to possible medical factors. He was knocked unconscious by a pitched ball in a game on September 1st, 1909, and I wondered if there might be lingering effects from the head trauma. I wondered too, as we were looking at the Keeley injections, some of the ingredients that were rumored to have been or claimed to have been found in the gold cure might have been poisonous. So was that a factor or not? Ultimately, I'm not a medical professional, and even if I were, I don't think there's sufficient evidence to draw any conclusions about that. When the end came for Raymond, it came fairly quickly. After he was suspended from the Giants in 1911, he pitched ineffectively for semi-pro and independent league teams. That fall, his younger daughter dies. One report says influenza, but I haven't been able to confirm that. His drinking intensifies. His wife and remaining child, in an echo of the D.W. Griffith movie that we talked about earlier. He does not repent. She goes to live with her parents. He attempts to make a comeback in the United States League. He is unable to pitch on opening day. People can't rouse him from his state, and he's unable to answer the call on opening day. He is subsequently found dead in Chicago with a skull fracture following a fight that happened at a local semi-pro ball game. It's interesting to note that none of the subsequent progress of Raymond's career finds its way into any of the colorful characters' tales. There's no echo of this in Grantland Rice or in Red Smith or in Glory of Their Times. It's hinted that, yeah, he died, but nobody really talks about the toll that this took on Raymond. And it's one of the what I was hoping that would come out of this research was some understanding of the evolution of understanding of addiction and alcoholism for athletes, but and reflected in society as at large. But it seems to me that sports writing, especially during this period, was still stuck in a mode that it couldn't get out of, and that probably wouldn't, and to some extent still isn't. I mean, we still make jokes about, oh, Doc Ellis pitched a no-hitter on LSD, isn't that funny? But to some extent, it was not until the 70s and 80s when sports started to take substance abuse seriously, and we don't see, I was expecting to see some primitive echoes of that in stories about Raymond and other ball players, and I was not able to see that. As it turned out. I will have to skip over a couple of elements, except that one of the tragic things, I think, perhaps tragedy is overstating it, is that the story as we told it, where Wagner is Raymond's undoing, quite frankly, Raymond owned Wagner, and I don't have time to get into that story, but it's an interesting part of the story. And I also wasn't able to get into some of the confusion around the newspaper stories covering Raymond's death in September of 1912, but I did want to thank Richard Smiley for helping me with that research, and that will go into the written version of this research. I'm available for questions.
Well, thank you very much, RJ. It's always interesting to get into the sociology around baseball, not usually something that we deal with in SABR, but of course it is interesting. There are some questions which I will bring up in a second here.
I see Perry's note about head trauma, and yeah, I would like to know. It seems like, especially 1910s, 1911s, players are always being knocked unconscious, and I wondered about. I think that would be an interesting study.
Well, that's something we'll never know.
Yeah.
Tara Krieger wants to know, did Bugs Raymond stories never evolve from the delightful little romps, in part because of the attitudes towards sports writing being not to tell bad stuff about their heroes? You generally heard the same crazy things about Rube Waddell, for instance, who was a contemporary.
I think, yeah, one thing I would have expected would be to have at least seen some more of the cautionary tales. Kids, don't try this at home. There's a little bit of that. Some of the Chicago papers in the aftermath of Bugs Raymond's death talk about that. Look what happens, kids, when you turn to alcohol. But there was very little of that. I expected to see more of that, especially once we got into, into the 40s and 50s, and there was none. That didn't turn up.
On a similar note, David H. Lippman once says, we know that Larry Ritter and Rube Marquardt spiced up his chapter. Could that have been the case in his stories about Bugs? I
think it might have been. I think, and similar to some of the other stories in there, again, Ritter and the ball players he's talking to are probably coming out of that same tradition that we talked about with Grantland Rice and so forth. They're repeating the stories they've heard, or in Marquardt's case, did it. Marquardt was a teammate of Raymond, but he's not really talking about Raymond as if he's a teammate. He's talking about almost, they say, the Raymond story says, they say Bugs used to do this. It's like, well, you were there. Did he do it or not? It's told in a funny way. So it's almost told in the sense of that sports writer repeating a story being told rather than Marquardt being there. So yeah, that's a good point. That would be interesting to know more about.
Victor asks a question that I'm sorry to say we probably know the answer to. why did Lou Sockalexis not get the same happy drunk treatment from contemporary writers?
I think we do know the answer to that. I don't know. I haven't studied Sockalexis' story as much, so I don't know all the details on that. But I suspect the racial profiling had a lot to do with that.
Michael Haupert asks, player contracts from this year often had temperance clauses, imposing financial penalties for violating them or rewards for abstaining. Do you think that such financial incentives were useful?
I don't know that I could say. It would be an interesting topic.
Okay, and Perry Barber wants to know if you know anything about the Raymond's daughter. What did she die of? Was it an accident? Was it an illness?
It was illness. One story that appeared years later said influenza, but I haven't found a contemporary account yet. I was able to find something from the spring of 1912 where Raymond's wife is appealing to McGraw for reinstatement on Raymond's behalf, and they mention the death of the daughter but don't give a cause. And then, you know, the statement about influenza is many years later, so I don't know how much credence to give it.
David Lippman asked a lot of questions. He wants you to comment on how it's interesting to compare the treatment of Raymond with how CC Sabathia went to rehab, and that today's hard-drinking ball player gets different treatment. Comments?
I think that's an improvement. I mean, to some extent, and I mean, there's still a lot people have to learn about. And I thought, you know, some of the popular press discussion about Sabathia and with Josh Hamilton was, I think, in some respects, there was a lot of ignorance on the subject, and in the case of both men. I remember when reading about it, but I think it's still appropriate to talk about it and be, you know, take away the stigma about it so that people can get the help they need. But
okay. Well, thank you again, RJ. While I'm bringing up the next speaker, let me mention that the raffle is still going. For instance, if you'd like a chance to win a limited edition Bill James bobblehead, I know I would, for just $5, you can enter the SABR Virtual raffle and have the chance to win several baseball memorabilia prizes. Go to sabr.org/virtual-meetings for more info. And the winners will be announced tomorrow, I believe, is the day, because it's going to be the last day of SABR Virtual. So now let me get Edward Scahill unmuted, if I can. Oops, I lost him. Hang on just a second here, folks. Okay, he is unmuted, and I will now introduce him. He's our last speaker of McGraw Day. His paper is called Hugh, Jennings, and John McGraw at St. Bonaventure University. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Scranton. He's published baseball research in several peer-reviewed economics journals, including an article on monopoly power and markets for the Journal of Economics Teaching. That was very recent. His favorite team is the New York Mets. So, Edward Scahill, the floor is yours.
Neal, thank you so much. This is pretty exciting for me. I thought we'd be in Baltimore and get a chance to go to the real Field of Dreams, but this is a pretty good substitute. Before I get started, I just found out on my phone that Regis Philbin has passed away. I don't know if anybody else has heard about that. And the other big news out of Buffalo, my hometown this week, even though the Toronto Blue Jays don't want to do it, they're going to play the first regular season Major League games in Buffalo since 1915. So that's pretty good news. Okay, my presentation again has to do with my alma mater, St. Bonaventure University, and two guys who a lot of people wouldn't expect to be associated with St. Bonaventure because we were not a baseball school when I was there, and we're still not. And in fact, through the 1950s, and when I started attending at Bonaventure 1969, we had some really good basketball teams. It's still a Division I program, but back in those days, there was no ESPN, there was no Big East Conference, so we were pretty competitive with Villanova, Duquesne, Syracuse. And we had some really great basketball players. Now, the first picture I'm going to show you is someone that I was really too young to know, but I certainly remember Tom Stith, who played for us from 58 to 61. He was a #1 draft choice after his time at Bonas. His brother also played for us, Sam Stith. And he was drafted first by the New York Knickerbockers. Both he and his brother tragically contracted tuberculosis, so that shortened his career. But when I was there, I hope some of you still remember Bob Lanier, a great All-America center, and a #1 draft pick of the Detroit Pistons after his senior year. We got to the Final Four, and without going into a lot of details, Bob got hurt in the East Final and couldn't make the Final Four. That's the last time. The planets were aligned in 1970, and they're not going to be aligned again. So my point is, that's where attention was. It wasn't on baseball. We had Division I basketball, #1 activity. For those of us who skied, now of course there had to be snow. We had a couple of ski resorts pretty close by, and this is probably the most common pastime. We had an on-campus Rathskeller that sold an awful lot of Schaefer beer. You old guys like me remember the drinking age in those days was 18, so we spent a lot of time in the Rathskeller. We couldn't have a car on campus until we were seniors, so that was kind of our social life. Now this is a contemporary picture of the campus, and it's from the back side of the campus, as I noted here. It's pretty close to the Allegheny River. So from the river to the ball field, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 yards. And it looks nicer now than it did then, and certainly when McGraw and Jennings were there. And Fred Handler was a baseball coach. He was there when I was there. But at that time, it was just called McGraw-Jennings Field. And I'm kind of embarrassed by this, especially talking to all you SABR guys. I really didn't rack my brain for this. I don't remember knowing the connection between John McGraw and Bonaventure, or asking about it, or knowing if any of my friends knew anything about it. Just kind of figured this is the field named after John McGraw. The Jennings part, I have to admit, I didn't know anything about Hugh Jennings at the time. That would come much later. But John was born in Truxton, New York, April 7th, 1873. Passed away 1934 in New Rochelle, New York. And I thought I'd include a map which shows the approximate location of Truxton. If you're familiar with New York State and Pennsylvania route, Interstate 81 goes straight down from Syracuse. It passes Cortland, which is very close to Truxton. If you keep going, you're going to hit Binghamton and Scranton and Pittston, where, as you'll see, Huey was from. Olean is about here. Very rural, pastoral location. The university isn't in Olean. We're between Olean and a smaller town named Allegheny. And when John was growing up, this is from Charles Alexander's biography of McGraw. He was one of millions of youngsters who not only fantasized about playing baseball professionally, but practiced endlessly and played as often as they could in the hope that somehow some kind of opportunity would come along. This is an unbelievable picture. I'm going to read you from my notes. John, when he grew up in Truxton, his father, also named John, settled there in 1871. John Sr. and his wife would have 8 children. John was the oldest. And in the winter of 1884-85, a diphtheria epidemic would claim the lives of John Sr.'s wife, Ellen. Actually, his second wife, his first wife, had passed away too, so he had a lot of very bad luck. Four of his children also died in that same epidemic, and as young John grew older, the father expected him, can't blame him, to share the responsibility of raising his family. And damn it, quit playing that stupid game. I think that was the attitude of a lot of parents whose kids were infatuated with baseball. But he developed the passion for baseball that wouldn't quit, and his father could not abide. In the fall of 1885, after learning that his son had broken yet another one of their neighbors' windows, if I could ask for a show of hands, how many people have broken a window playing baseball? I'm one of them. I did run away. You know, I told my dad about it and he fixed the window. But that was the last straw. And John's father flew into a rage. John left the house. He didn't leave Truxton, but he did find a woman named Mary Goddard, a very nice widow, who ran a place called the Truxton House, and she put him up, and he stayed there, still in contact with the family, but obviously somewhat estranged. He could still play baseball. And in 1889, he began playing ball for a local team managed by a game named Bert Kenny. And Kenny, around that time, had bought into a new franchise that would be located in Olean, New York. There's the connection. As a member of the Nine-Pen League, not New York, Pennsylvania, of course. And upon hearing that Kenny was recruiting players, McGraw successfully lobbied for a contract for the 1890 season. I stumbled across this photograph, and it's pretty amazing. McGraw could have been no more than 16 or 17 years old. He only played for the Olean team 1 year, and that team would not last very long after that. So this had to be taken around that time. And look at how young this guy is. One thing I like about doing research about McGraw, Jennings, and the people that they played with, you see pictures of them when they're young, healthy. They don't have a pot belly, gray hair. We're still used to watching pictures or seeing pictures of people like McGraw and Jennings when they're managing near the end of their careers. Anyway, while he was in Olean, he eventually played that 1 year. He caught out with another team in nearby Wellsville, New York, not too far from Olean. And in the spring of 1891, McGraw played for the Cedar Rapids Canaries. And a friend of Bill Barney, manager of the American Association's Baltimore franchise, recommended that he be given a chance to play. That's when he went to Baltimore. I'm going to back up a little bit, because while he was still in Olean, again, not very long, McGraw had become friends with a young Franciscan faculty member from nearby Allegheny College. It wasn't St. Bonaventure at the time. They renamed it shortly after this period of time. It was actually an Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. So there was some confusion about the two schools, so that led to this name change. And the Reverend Joseph F. Dolan also served as the school's athletic director and became friends with McGraw. And one evening while having dinner together at the college, Dolan spoke to McGraw about the advantages of a college education for a young man who may or may not, who knew at the time, have a future in professional sports. 2 years later, McGraw thought that rather than spend his off season in Baltimore, go back to Truxton, I probably didn't want to see his father anyway, he'd offer Father Dolan and the college a proposition, and this is it. If the college would let him enroll, let him take some courses, waive his tuition, and provide him with room and board, he would be willing to coach the college baseball team after the first of the new year, so around January. And with consent from the Reverend Joseph Butler, the college's president, Dolan shortly let McGraw know that he was welcome to come under the arrangement he had proposed. Now, this has nothing to do with my presentation directly, but I found this interesting. This is a picture, now McGraw's not in here, but look at the uniforms. Some say St. Bonaventure, some say Allegheny College. So you're seeing this team right at the change. They're probably figured, hey, those Allegheny uniforms still are usable. why spend a lot of money on new uniforms? So they had about half the team with bonnet jerseys on and half, well, maybe not half. Some of these were in Allegheny uniforms. And this is Hugh Jennings. I like this picture of Hugh too. For those of you who know Hugh's story, is a very interesting guy. I'm not going to talk about his managerial career with the Detroit Tigers and all the problems he had with Ty Cobb and his teammates. But he became a lawyer. And I love this picture of him because he doesn't look like a ball player. And as I mentioned about the early pictures of McGraw and some of their teammates in Baltimore, they look great, don't they? I mean, they look young and healthy athletes, and yet we always see them when they're kind of old and over the hill. Anyway, Jennings was born in Pittston, PA in 1869. Pittston, most of you won't know this, but it's just south of Scranton. Again, if you go down 81, you're going to run into Pittston and later on Wilkes-Barre. So that's where he's from. This was coal country at the time. And that's the approximate location. This is Luzerne County. I'm in Lackawanna County right now, near Scranton, and just outside the city. So that's where Huey grew up. And this is from Jack Smiles' biography. There are a lot more written about John McGraw, but Iya is a biography that was written by Jack Smiles. And Jack is a SABR guy. And I don't know if he's retired yet. I think he's in his early 70s, but he wrote for a newspaper in Pittston and obviously got interested in Huey's career. And that's kind of the source for a lot of information about Huey, especially in the early days. And this is from that book. I worked hard to make good because I had a goal set and wanted to realize an ambition. I worked to attain a certain end, and that was to be free of the minds once and for all. And man, who can blame him? And a little background. His dad, James, and his wife, James's wife, emigrated from Ireland and settled in Pittston in 1851. Don't take this the wrong way, okay? I'm Irish. My dad's family was 100% Irish. Jennings was a teetotaler. I'm sorry, this is the only Irishman, especially from Ireland, I know who didn't drink. I'm sure there were others. And when he did come, he found work in a nearby coal mine, expected that his 8 sons would find work there as well. Huey did work as a breaker boy when he was real young, and a mule driver in a mine later on, and he was working his way up. Apparently he was a good employee. But as McGraw did, he developed an early love of baseball and didn't want to spend the rest of his working life in a coal mine. I mean, we hear these stories over and over and over again, well into the 20th century. Hey, Mom and Dad, I want to play baseball. What? That's a game. You can't make a living playing a game. Come on. You're going to be a farmer just like your dad. You're going to work in the coal mine. You're going to get in the steel plant. And these guys are so determined, not going to do it. And I think they would have run through a brick wall in order to reach the goal. Skipped a sentence. When he was only 13, he was a catcher for the Moosic Pounders. Moosic is another town even closer to Scranton than Pittston. And he played for the Pounders through 1881. And in 1889, a club from nearby Lehighton recruited Huey. And in 1891, John Chapman, the manager of the American Association's Louisville franchise, was desperate to find a replacement for the injured catcher. Didn't have to spend too much money recruiting and scouting in those days. This guy reads a newspaper account, hey, this Jennings sounds like he's a catcher and he's pretty good, I'll get him. And this is the turning point for a lot of these kids. He offered Jennings a monthly salary of $175. Whoa, you can make that much playing this game? Okay, go. You have my blessing. Just send us part of the money when you get it. And in 1893, Ned Hanlon, famous manager, Foxy Ned, ultimately from the Baltimore Orioles. Barney had left his position as manager. Now it's Hanlon is in charge of the Orioles. He'd seen Huey play for Louisville and worked out a trade for him. Huey soon joined McGraw in Baltimore, and the rest is history. They became extremely close friends. And as Alexander points out in his, I think, maybe it was Jack Smiles in it, somebody mentioned, when he first went to Baltimore, Huey was vying for the same position as McGraw. So you'd expect this hothead to be very competitive, you know, stay out of my way. Didn't happen. They became extremely close. Maybe it was the Irish connection. Anyway, I love this picture. Look at these stars. There are multiple Hall of Famers in this picture. I think 8 future managers, including Kid Gleason, the future manager of the 1919 Black Sox, Joe Kelly, Wilbert Robinson, Robbie, Hugh Jennings over to my right, McGraw in the front with Willie Keeler, hit them where they ain't. Great picture from 1894. I like this little note at the bottom. Some are present day managers. So I don't think they mean, you know, 2012. And this is Alumni Hall. This wasn't on campus when I was there. The reason I included in this picture, it was torn down, by the way, in December 1961. But the weather, believe it or not, in Western New York is sometimes not so great in January and February. Take my word for it. And they would have practices indoors when they had inclement weather. And in the basement, you know, they had a batting cage and everything. So when they coached at Bonaventure, this is one of the buildings they used. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, because as this next slide tells us, during the winter of when McGraw returned to the Orioles in the spring of 1893, so he had been coaching Bonaventure, loved it. He became close friends with Jennings, and McGraw offered to ask Father Dolan, hey, how about allowing my friend Huey to join me as a baseball coach and student in the offseason? Now get this. This is a nothing baseball. We're not talking about USC or Vanderbilt, some big time program. It's St. Bonaventure. They didn't pay these guys. They had 2 future Hall of Famers who were going to coach the baseball team. So he asked Father Dolan if he'd allow Jennings to have the same deal that he had. Jennings was all in, yeah, let's do it. So they did. Now there is some disagreement about when they started. I talked to the archivist at Freedom Library at Bonaventure last year, but this comes from Hugh. I think it was written around 1926 or so. During the winter of 1893-94, McGraw had attended St. Bonaventure's College, as he called it, and he arrived in camp in the spring of 1894 exceedingly enthusiastic. He kept preaching to me on the subject of the advantages of education. And finally, I decided to join him. We applied ourselves to our studies, and in February, we began to coach the baseball team. This continued until we had to leave for spring training camp with the Baltimores. We both returned for 3 more years. Now, I did find out they didn't get a degree, which wasn't that uncommon in those days. And I don't think they ever got an honorary degree later on, which is a little bit surprising. Anyway, in 1898, I went back to St. Bonaventure again, but McGraw did not. The following February, 1899, accepted a position as coach of the Cornell University team. Not really part of this particular story, but he would get he didn't get a degree from Cornell in law, but he was able to pass the bar, and he became a lawyer in Scranton later on. And this is a team photo. You know, Jennings is here on one end of the last row, McGraw on the other end, but these faces seem so washed out. I'm wondering if somebody did a cut and paste job, I don't know. But this is the rest of the team. They did play and they did coach these guys. And Father James, the manager. Well, anyway, fast forward. I mean, history's made. I did want to mention too about the Baltimore team. Yeah, Robert Kramer, and talking about the 1894 Orioles, the team whose picture I showed you before. I mean, I'm talking to you guys, right? So you know this story. This is from Robert Kramer. They were a team whose stars peaked together, whose best years came at the same time. The greatest team of all time until the 1927 Yankees came along. And great sportsmen, great gentlemen on diamond. They never got arguments with umpires. And of course, I'm joking, but they played pretty damn well. Anyway, fast forward. Now, at the time in 1927, Huey was ill. And there was a feeling that he had a nervous breakdown. Ultimately, he would have contracted tuberculosis, and he passed away in 1928. But McGraw was invited back to Bonaventure, and they were going to dedicate this field to John McGraw. And this is what John had to say on that occasion. It would be an injustice to me, to the baseball world, and the college. And what is most important to Huey? By the way, there's some discrepancy about how to spell his name. No, I-E-E-Y. We know who we're talking about. The most pleasant experiences of my life were in the company of my friend here on these same grounds, which he would dedicate in my name today in the absence of my chum and invalid. By the way, he was coaching the Giants along with McGraw in the early 20s when they won a couple World Series. I consider it not only inappropriate, but unfitting to call this McGraw Field. I will not consent to it. Well, naturally, they're not going to say, well, too bad, go home. We're not going to name the field after you. So indeed, it was called McGraw Jennings Field. And Bonaventure's president at the time, Reverend Thomas Plassman, one of our buildings to be named after Father Plassman later on, agreed with McGraw's request for the name to be changed to McGraw Jennings Field. I think this is someone after that. I can't really date this photo, but it might have been maybe in the 50s, I'm not sure. As you'll find in another slide, the baseball program was disbanded in 1933. Obviously, it was a tough period of time for the whole country, but then it was reconstituted in 1950. So maybe this was taken at that time, I'm not sure. And this is from the St. Bonaventure Laurel. It's kind of like a school magazine that I found at the library. And let me just read from this, and part of what I'm going to say is on the slide. A 1950 article that appeared in the St. Bonaventure Laurel recognized the reestablishment of the school's varsity baseball program, which had been dropped in 1933. The article recounted the years when the university hosted some of the sport's biggest names. Parenthetically here, I didn't include it in the slides, but when McGraw was manager, he would have teams come and play in this dinky little field. It didn't look as nice as it does now even, but it was John McGraw. So they had a lot of the Giants and other stars from Major League Baseball that would play barnstorming games on that field. The article recounted the years when the university hosted some of the sport's greatest names. After all, this is a quote from the article. After all these years, Bonaventure begins the long, hazardous way back. In other words, to get the baseball program rolling again. St. Bonaventure's president, Father Juvenile Labor, OFM, sits above the former home plate of the college's McGraw Jennings Field. The old Baltimore Orioles and the New York Giants played there on numerous occasions. Besides McGraw and Jennings, Babe Ruth, Rogers Hornsby, Hannes Wagner, Milan, and others lifted many a ball of the row of pine trees flanking the field. During the years 1892 to 95, McGraw spent his off seasons at St. Bonaventure. Again, there's a dispute about the exact years he was there, and persuaded Huey Jennings to join him in 1893. The two attended school in the fall and winter, coached the college team as player managers in the spring, and played for the Orioles in the summer. Jennings was a student at St. Bonaventure from 1894. The same year became a Baltimore regular until 1897. This is a great quote. After his death, Mrs. Jennings recalled, Hugh and I would have long walk talks. I'm going to try this again. Huey and I would have long talks about his career, and he always said that some of his happiest days were spent during the 3 years at Bonas. He loved athletics and people, and there, meaning Bonas, he had a chance to enjoy both at the respective unsoiled best. I just want to add in closing that I have an office on campus of the University of Scranton, of course. And while I was doing research, I found an account of Hughie's funeral, and it mentioned his address when he passed away. And I said, Vine Street, that's a 5-minute walk. And so I walked over, I took a couple pictures. The building's not there, but it almost like fate was drawing me to this topic. I mean, what are the odds that I go to Bonaventure, where this guy was coaching along with McGraw, and I ended up in Scranton starting in 1989, where Jennings spent his last years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Edward, for a really interesting talk. Let me pull up the questions. There haven't been very many questions, but of course, if you have some, you can still submit them through the chat. I know I saw something. Hang on. Who was DSM wants to know, during McGraw's time, was Bradner Stadium the site of Olean's biggest games?
Oh, that's a good question. That's, as I mentioned, most of us didn't have cars until senior year. So I didn't spend too much time down there. I really don't know if that field was around that early. But again, the baseball team would have been playing on campus. But, you know, maybe if Bradner's around, they were playing some games. That's a good question.
Okay. Stephen wants to know, what was the original cost of the field? How much of it was in donations, and did McGraw and Jennings contribute toward it?
I'm sure the last question is no. I did run across this little card that was sent out. It was almost like a little postcard. They sent out, we're going to dedicate this field, and I'm sure it went to alums and benefactors of the college/university. I'm not sure when he changed it to the name to the university, but they probably got money that way. But if you look at if you look at an old diagram of the field, there was not that much there. You and I could have raised enough money to pay for, you know, a few bases, maybe the fence, a couple benches, but there wasn't even the fence around the outside. Well, there was probably there, but I'm sure the cost wasn't exorbitant.
Oh, here's a good question from John B. How were they able to coach and go to spring training?
Well, you know, that's interesting, because if you remember, the quote from McGraw was, well, I can come and coach after the first of the year. And Jennings made a reference to February. So I don't think they were coaching that long, because they would not have avoided going to spring training. They may have been there for just a couple months.
And I guess they were coaching while they were students.
Yeah, actually, there's another quote. I didn't read it. It was from, I think, the manager of the baseball team, about how John was a great student. He was a pretty good math student, from what I understand. Not surprising. He had that type of mind. But he said, boy, this studying is a lot harder than wrestling with umpires. I don't think he found it very hard to wrestle with umpires, so I'm not sure that quote means too much.
Well, that's a good way to end the session, I believe, on a nice humorous note. Thank everyone for attending SABR Virtual today. The presentations will be posted online on SABR's YouTube channel afterwards if you want to go back and watch them again. And you can find the complete schedule for tomorrow or register for tomorrow's SABR Virtual sessions on our website at sabr.org. Thank you again. And
I can add something real quick.
Sure.
I'm sure the other presenters agree with me. This is a wonderful turnout. I mean, it's Saturday afternoon. You people have better things to do. So I'm sure we all appreciate everyone showing up and making such wonderful comments and questions.
Yeah,
I'll second that.
It's been excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm going to end the Zoom now. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.